The Devouring Fog. The night was deep and tranquil in Olympic National Park. A canopy of stars glittered overhead, casting a faint silver glow on the quiet forest below. Just off a small clearing, a lone van sat parked, the nearby trees casting shadows across its painted surface. Leaning against a camping chair outside the van was Greg Miller, sipping a steaming cup of tea as he took in the moonlit beauty around him. Greg had spent most of his life in Dallas, Texas, grinding away in corporate America, where his days had been a blur of board meetings and budget reports. But last year, at 41, he'd finally had enough. One evening, he'd handed in his resignation, sold most of his belongings, and bought a well-loved van with his life savings. Now, he spent his days exploring every corner of the country and living by his own rules, truly experiencing life for the first time in years. Greg sighed contentedly, tipping his head back to take in the full moon above, its glow filtering through the tall pines surrounding his camp. Olympic National Park had been a dream of his since childhood, and now he was here, basking in the park's immense beauty and reveling in the freedom he'd worked so hard to achieve. The tea was rich and comforting as he took another sip, the warmth of it grounding him in the cool, crisp night air. But something caught his eye just beyond the trees. He squinted, making out what looked like smoke while drifting between the tree trunks. Alarmed, he sat up, worry clenching his gut. Fires could be deadly out here. He knew that. His mind raced as he scanned for signs of a fire's glow or crackling sound, but nothing else seemed amiss. He stood, straining his eyes. The misty glimmer floated in the distance, almost alive as it moved, but then he realized it wasn't smoke at all. It was fog, a light, silvery mist rolling gently through the forest. He felt his pulse slow as relief washed over him. Fog was normal this time of year, he reassured himself, a simple part of the damp, temperate climate. Relaxing, he chuckled at his own jumpiness, then settled back into his chair, allowing his mind to drift as he took in the stillness of the night. The next morning he was up with the dawn, eager to explore the cliffs he'd read about before his trip. Greg quickly brewed his morning coffee and threw together a small backpack of supplies. As he stepped out into the cool morning air, he paused, breathing in the scent of pine and the distant tang of the ocean. He locked the van and set out, finding a well-marked trail leading toward the cliffs. The hike was exhilarating, winding through towering trees and across roots that twisted like snakes beneath his feet. At last, the trail opened up to reveal a rugged cliffside where Greg could see the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly to the horizon. The mist that had lingered in the trees last night now hung over the water, spreading across the vast expanse in a thin layer. He watched, mesmerized as it moved strangely fast, weaving through the rocks and toward the shore. Greg felt an odd twinge as he watched the fog approach, a prickling unease that he quickly brushed aside. Fog moved with the weather. That was no mystery. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deliberate about the way it drifted. Dismissing the thought, he continued to watch the waves roll in, the peaceful sound soothing his nerves. By late afternoon, Greg was on his way back to the van, feeling more at ease. But as he descended the trail, he noticed the fog off to his left, just beyond the trees. It seemed to be keeping pace with him, trailing him through the woods in a way that felt almost intentional. "Don't be ridiculous, Greg," he muttered to himself. "Fog doesn't follow people." But as he continued down the path, he kept glancing back at it, and every time he looked it was still there, drifting alongside him, weaving between the trees in soft, undulating waves. By the time he reached the clearing and caught sight of his van, he was almost running, trying to escape the oppressive sensation of being watched. That night, Greg set up a small grill by his van to cook his dinner. The fog had returned, now pooling at the edges of the clearing, and he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that it was closing in on him. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the smell of his cooking and the warmth of the small fire. But as he looked up, his chest tightened. The fog had thickened around his van, swirling in slow circles like some kind of living thing. His skin prickled, and a sense of dread settled in his gut. He wanted to move, to rush back inside his van and lock the door, but he felt paralyzed, trapped by the sight of the mist spiraling closer and closer. Then, just as he tried to pull in a shaky breath, the fog began to shift. He gasped as it surged forward, filling his mouth and nose, choking him as it poured into his lungs. The air grew cold, and his vision blurred as the fog forced itself into him, filling him with a biting chill that made his teeth ache. He struggled, clawing at the air, but the mist was relentless, filling every inch of his body until he felt he would drown in it. But just as quickly as it had come, the fog receded, leaving him gasping and shivering on the ground. He lay there, dazed, staring up at the dark, swirling mass above him as it slowly drifted away. His hands trembled as he pushed himself up, barely able to comprehend what had just happened. Without another thought, he scrambled to his feet and threw himself into the van, locking the doors and collapsing onto the bed in a heap. His body was exhausted, his mind foggy with shock and fear. Within moments he fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the exhaustion claiming him completely. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the van's windows, casting a warm glow across the interior. Greg groaned as he sat up, still shaken from the events of the previous night. He rubbed his face, the memory of the fog rushing back with a sickening clarity. He stumbled toward the small sink, splashing cold water onto his face, desperate to shake off the lingering unease. As he reached for his toothbrush, he caught sight of himself in the small mirror above the sink. He froze, staring. The face looking back at him was his, but different. He touched his cheek, tracing the smoothness of his skin, the absence of the small wrinkles he'd grown accustomed to seeing over the years. His dark hair, usually peppered with gray, was now thick and lustrous, with no sign of silver. Slowly he brought his hand to his face, tracing the lines, or lack thereof. His reflection looked like a man in his early 20s, young and vibrant in a way he hadn't been in years. He staggered back, his mind reeling. He looked younger, much younger. The memory of the fog filled his thoughts again, how it had poured into him, and he shuddered, gripping the edge of the sink as he tried to make sense of it. The day drifted by in a surreal haze as he grappled with the reality of what had happened. By the afternoon, he found himself on a nearby trail, wandering aimlessly through the forest, his mind racing. Every time he passed a reflective surface, a puddle, a stray piece of metal, he couldn't help but stop and look, his youthful reflection both shocking and mesmerizing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he felt the familiar prickle of unease creep over him once more. The fog had returned, pooling between the trees in thin, curling wisps. He could see it shifting, gathering around him, as though waiting. He backed away, his heart pounding. He didn't know what the fog wanted, or why it had given him this strange gift of youth. All he knew was that he needed to get away from it before it took something else. Before it took him. In a rush, he ran back to his van, slamming the door shut behind him. The fog pressed against the windows, swirling in thick, restless waves as it seemed to test every inch of the van's exterior, searching for a way in. He sat in the driver's seat, staring out at the shifting mass, feeling his pulse race as it loomed closer. He needed to leave. He couldn't stay here, not with whatever that thing was lurking in the woods. In a frenzy, he started the engine, the roar of it startling in the silent night. The fog pulsed around him, almost as if it were alive, but he forced himself to focus, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he shifted into gear. As he drove away, the fog chased him, swirling through the trees and spilling onto the road, trailing after him like a living shadow. He didn't stop until he was miles away, parked in a small crowded campground where the bright lights and bustling activity felt like a sanctuary against the creeping darkness he'd left behind. In the days that followed, Greg kept driving, moving from place to place, never staying long enough for the fog to find him again. But every time he caught a glimpse of himself in a mirror, he couldn't help but remember that night in the forest, the cold touch of the fog and the strange gift, or curse, it had left him with. The reflection that stared back at him was one of youth, of a man who had left the corporate world behind to find freedom and purpose. Yet every time he looked, he felt a hollow fear gnaw in his soul. He knew he would run out of road soon.